Good morning. This is Environmental Intelligence, episode 25. It's April 17th, 2026. Here's your concise Friday briefing. The intelligence that actually moves project budgets, liability positions, and regulatory submissions before the weekend. We begin on the West Coast, where British Columbia's Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship has opened a series of free recycling drop-off events for expanded polystyrene, EPS, foam dock materials at multiple Sunshine Coast locations. This initiative directly tackles one of the most persistent and frustrating forms of marine debris in coastal British Columbia. EPS docks and floats, widely used because of their buoyancy and low initial cost, degrade over time through UV exposure, wave action, and mechanical abrasion. The result is a steady release of centimeter-scale fragments and microplastic particles that foul shorelines, clog shellfish beds, and sorb hydrophobic organic contaminants such as PAHs. Under the Provincial Environmental Management Act, these fragments are regulated primarily as waste and physical litter rather than as a traditional chemical contaminant plume, which has historically left marina owners and consultants in a gray zone between high disposal costs and the temptation to dump illegally. The new free drop-off program removes the economic barrier that previously drove noncompliance. It creates a clear, auditable pathway that aligns with CCME guidelines on marine litter prevention and demonstrates proactive stewardship. For consultants and contractors supporting waterfront redevelopment, marina compliance audits, or remedial action plans in coastal British Columbia, this program is immediately actionable. It materially lowers client liability for improper disposal and satisfies Environmental Management Act waste management expectations. Implementation is scheduled to run through the entire 2026 boating season. What I find particularly noteworthy is the evolving regulatory posture. Ministry staff are increasingly willing to treat documented participation in these free programs as tangible evidence of due diligence. That shift can move residual liability discussions away from perpetual sediment dredging toward education, stewardship, and source control. The practical takeaway is straightforward. Map every active or planned client dock asset against the published Sunshine Coast drop-off windows today. Incorporate the service into decommissioning scopes and remedial action plans before the next round of Stage 2 CSR submissions. The most common mistake I still see is treating EPS as inert trash within a conventional risk assessment. In reality, it functions as a long-lived, mobile sorptive substrate that must be quantified separately. The fix is to add an explicit microplastic transport module to the conceptual site model, budget for polymer-specific analytical methods, such as FTIR or Raman spectroscopy on sieved fractions, and deploy a 500 micrometer Newston net transect rather than relying solely on standard PAH suites. Doing so produces defensible mass balance calculations and strengthens negotiations around responsible party cost allocation. Transitioning from marine debris management to marine operations decarbonization, the Federal Coast Clean Energy Innovation Challenge has announced its successful participants. These consortia will develop shore power connectivity, hybrid propulsion systems, and zero-emission vessel support technologies tailored to Canadian Coast Guard operational priorities. The selections operate under the clean technology stream of federal procurement and intersect meaningfully with compliance obligations under the Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act. For consultants, laboratories, and contractors holding ISO 17025 accreditation, the announcement is more than interesting. It is an immediate business development signal. Review the winning consortia rosters for potential subcontracting opportunities on monitoring, validation, or baseline characterization components. This initiative clearly indicates where federal decarbonization dollars are flowing in the marine sector over the next 24 to 36 months. Tracking these projects now positions accredited firms to secure early involvement rather than competing after budgets have hardened. While Canadian practitioners absorb these domestic signals, a significant cross-border development warrants attention. In the United States, the Senate voted to terminate the Biden-era moratorium on mining within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Watershed. The decision clears the path for Twin Metals' proposed copper-nickel mine in northern Minnesota. Although the project sits outside direct Canadian jurisdiction, it sits squarely within transboundary watersheds that ultimately drain into Ontario and Manitoba. The practical implication is an almost certain shift in baseline data expectations. Both the International Joint Commission and provincial water quality objectives may require updated downstream sediment and metals loading assumptions in the coming months. Practitioners supporting cross-border mining proposals, linear infrastructure projects, or cumulative effects assessments in the Lake of the Woods Winnipeg River system should immediately update their risk registers. Even modest increases in particulate metals or sulfate loading can trigger more stringent monitoring commitments under provincial environmental assessment processes and Federal Impact Assessment Act cumulative effects requirements. The prudent move is to brief mining sector clients this week on the potential for revised water quality modeling parameters before the next round of permitting meetings. Staying with atmospheric and global treaty issues, MIT researchers have quantified an overlooked compliance loophole in the Montreal Protocol. Continued emissions of certain chemicals still permitted under narrowly defined exemptions are occurring at materially higher rates than previously modeled. The result, according to the study, could delay full ozone column recovery by up to 7 years. For Canadian practitioners, this is not abstract science. Northern latitude UV exposure models, atmospheric dispersion modeling, and CEPA schedule. One substance management all operate with tighter margins once that 7-year delay is factored in. Sites in Yukon, Northwest Territories, Northern British Columbia, and coastal Labrador are particularly sensitive. Updated emission factors should be incorporated into any active air quality modeling, cumulative effects submissions, or site-specific risk assessments that rely on UV or stratospheric data. The adjustment is relatively straightforward but can change conclusions around ecological protection thresholds and human health risk estimates. Failing to reflect the new timeline risks submitting work that regulators may later deem outdated. Separately, new oceanographic research has demonstrated that microbes in nutrient-poor open ocean waters can produce methane under conditions previously considered negligible. With warming-induced stratification expected to increase this flux, the feedback loop has direct bearing on Canadian federal methane inventories maintained under CEPA. It also affects baseline characterization for offshore oil and gas environmental assessments in both the Atlantic and Pacific offshore regions. Practitioners should therefore revisit dissolved methane sampling protocols. Where stratification indicators, temperature, salinity, or dissolved oxygen profiles are present, consider adding microbial source tracking to differentiate between thermogenic, biogenic, and now microbially enhanced sources. This nuance matters when interpreting exceedances of CCME aquatic life guidelines or when defending baseline data sets during regulatory review. The cost of the additional analyses is modest compared with the risk of having an entire environmental assessment challenged on the basis of incomplete source attribution. Although not a Canadian story, the commencement of commercial generation at the largest single renewable energy project in the United States offers a valuable performance benchmark. The operational data set now available on capacity factors, grid integration costs, wildlife mitigation effectiveness, and long-term availability provides Canadian proponents with contemporary reference points for project financing and regulatory applications. Firms advising on renewable energy permitting under provincial environmental assessment statutes or the Federal Impact Assessment Act should integrate these metrics into their next set of proponent support documents. The data are particularly useful when negotiating wildlife offsetting commitments or when justifying conservative capacity factors to lenders and regulators. Similarly, Cuba's rapid increase in renewable share, from 3.6% in 2024 to 10% in 2025, driven largely by distributed solar, offers transferable lessons for Canadian engineering firms. The Caribbean experience illustrates how modular procurement, battery integration, and regulatory streamlining can succeed even under constrained grid conditions. Those insights translate directly to microgrid and remote community projects in northern Canada or Indigenous communities funded through federal clean energy streams. Canadian practitioners active in the Caribbean or in domestic remote community work should extract the procurement templates and interconnection approaches that proved most resilient. They often prove more applicable than lessons drawn from large, interconnected southern grids. To close the loop on the EPS marine debris discussion we opened with, consider a typical marina remediation project on the British Columbia coast. You arrive to find that historical dock replacements have left a measurable halo of fragmented EPS foam along the intertidal and shallow subtidal zones. Phase 2 sampling reveals elevated microplastic particle counts and sorbed PAHs that exceed British Columbia CSR, Schedule 6 sediment quality guidelines, yet laboratory reports return non-detect for parent styrene monomer. The regulatory lens continues to treat EPS primarily as physical litter under the Environmental Management Act, but experienced practitioners understand the material functions as both a vector for hydrophobic organics and a long-term secondary source term that must be characterized separately from traditional contaminant plumes. In the field, the defensible approach pairs a 500 micrometer Newston net transect with FTIR or Raman spectroscopy performed on sieved fractions. This distinguishes adsorbed contaminant load from any inherent polymer load and supports robust mass balance calculations that regulators respect. The 20-year consultant also recognizes that EPS fragmentation rates accelerate dramatically once cumulative UV and mechanical abrasion exceed site-specific exposure thresholds dictated by local wave climate and float maintenance history. That variable is rarely captured in generic marine litter guidance, yet proves critical when negotiating cost allocation among responsible parties. Regulators are now routinely accepting source control plans that explicitly incorporate the new free provincial drop-off programs as evidence of due diligence. This can materially shift residual liability from perpetual sediment management toward education, stewardship, and finite source removal. The single largest mistake remains treating EPS as inert trash within the risk assessment. The remedy is to add a dedicated microplastic transport module to the conceptual site model, budget for polymer-specific analytics upfront, and reference the free drop-off program in every 2026 waste management and remedial action plan for coastal British Columbia clients. Looking ahead at the calendar, April 22 to 24 marks the close of the Federal Impact Assessment Act early engagement period for several proposed Atlantic offshore energy projects. Ensure cumulative effects filings are current. April 30th is the British Columbia CSR annual performance reporting deadline for Schedule 2 contaminated sites in coastal regions. May 5th brings the CCME Technical Working Group webinar on microplastics monitoring protocols. Registration is strongly recommended for labs and risk assessors. May 15th is the anticipated release of updated federal methane inventory factors under CEPA. Schedule internal QA/QC reviews now for affected offshore and upstream clients. Before we wrap, keep an eye on tomorrow's developments around the federal methane inventory factors and how they may tighten offshore assessment baselines. That covers today's environmental intelligence. If you found this useful, share it with a colleague who needs to stay current. We're back tomorrow morning. 872. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.